The Alpha had its head down, the 6 great legs folded, and it was watching Marin Sol eat a nutrition bar at the far end of Pen Corridor C when Chief Hesov decided he had seen enough. I want to be precise about what I saw, because I filed the incident report, and I will stand behind every word of it. I was on the observation tier above the corridor, behind the reinforced viewport, which is where I had been spending an increasing portion of my shifts for the past 3 weeks. Not because anything had gone wrong. Because something had gone right in a way I could not yet name, and I am a man who has spent 22 years at Harrow Block 9 learning to name things before they kill someone. The Vorrkai had not killed anyone. That was the part I could not name. Let me back up. Harrow Block 9 is a maximum containment station in the outer belt of the Darathi Expanse. We hold 411 inmates across 12 cell tiers. And we use 9 Vorrkai to patrol the common corridors because nothing else has been sufficient. The Vorrkai are hexapedal. Each one masses roughly what a draft animal masses on a heavy gravity world, somewhere between 600 and 800 kilograms, depending on the individual. And they are armored from the base of the skull to the tip of the rearmost limb, with interlocking plates that have, in documented tests, deflected a standard issue pulse charge at close range. They are not domesticated, they are controlled. The distinction matters. A domesticated animal learns to want what you give it. Controlled animal learns that certain behaviors are associated with pain. The Vorrkai are controlled by handlers, and the handlers wear full articulated armor, because the Vorrkai, even controlled, will occasionally remind you what they are. We had gone through 6 handlers in 6 years. Not deaths. The Vorrkai are precise enough that all 6 walked away, but 3 were transferred on medical grounds, 2 resigned their contracts, and 1, a decorated veteran of the Karath internment campaigns, submitted a written request to serve in a theater of active orbital bombardment rather than return to Pen Corridor C. His request was granted. I did not blame him. Marin Sol arrived on a Tuesday, which is what we call the second rotation of the station week, because someone long ago decided we needed a human word for it. She was 37 years old. Her contract listed her previous posting as agricultural deterrent management on a tier colony, and she carried 1 bag. She was not large, she had a plain face and short dark hair, and she wore standard issue contractor fatigues that had been washed enough times that the color had gone from charcoal to something closer to ash. She did not carry her armor kit through the docking bay. She carried it in a separate parcel under her arm, the way a person carries something they intend to put down as soon as they find a flat surface. First thing she asked me was where the feed storage was. Not where the Vorrkai were staged. Not what the incident log looked like. Feed storage. I showed her. She read the nutritional spec sheets for 40 minutes, asked 2 precise questions about the Vorrkai's seasonal appetite variants, questions I had to look up the answers to, which had not happened to me in 11 years of running this block. And then she asked if she could go into the Pen corridor. I told her the standard protocol required a full armor fitting, a safety briefing, and a paired entry with a senior handler until she had logged 20 supervised hours. She said that sounded reasonable and asked if we could start the armor fitting. Now, we fitted her. It took an hour. When we were done, she looked at the articulated gauntlets for a moment, set them carefully on the bench, and said she thought she would leave those off for the initial assessment. My second shift officer, Parath, started to object. My hand on his arm and told him to let her proceed. I do not know, even now, why I did that. 22 years of institutional judgment, maybe. Or something in the way she had read those spec sheets. The same flat attention she gave to numbers that my most experienced staff flinched away. I told myself I would pull her out at the first sign of contact. I went to the observation tier. Parath stood beside me with his hand near the emergency seal control, and we watched. She walked into Pen Corridor C with her helmet on and her gauntlets off, and she stopped about 4 meters inside the door and stood still. The Vorrkai did not charge. They do not always charge. Sometimes they circle. Sometimes the Alpha comes forward alone, while the others spread laterally, which is the formation we had learned to call the fan, and which precedes the charge by roughly 3 seconds. The Alpha came forward. It stopped 2 meters from Marin Sol and lowered its head, until the armored crest was level with her collarbone, and it breathed. Parath said, very quietly, that he was opening the seal. I told him to wait. The Alpha breathed for what I later counted as 11 seconds. Then it raised its head, turned, walked back to the pack, and lay down. Marin stood there for another minute. Then she walked back to the door, came out, took off the helmet, and said she would like to see the feeding schedule. I said, what just happened? She thought about it. She said she wasn't entirely sure, but her best guess was that the Alpha had been checking whether she was afraid, and she wasn't, and it had seemed to satisfy it. I asked her, were you afraid? She said she supposed she had been somewhere around a 4 out of 10, hadn't seemed worth acting on. I did not know what to do with that answer. I filed it in the part of my mind where I put things I would need to think about later, and I went back to work. That was day 1. By day 8, the pack had stopped circling when she entered the corridor. By day 11, the 3 juveniles, we call them the Littles, is not an official designation but it stuck, had begun following her at a distance of roughly 2 meters during her feeding rounds, close enough that their breath misted against the back of her fatigues. By day 15, the Alpha had taken to sitting 2 meters to her left while she prepped the feed canisters, and it sat with the particular stillness that the Vorrkai use when they are watching something they have decided belongs to them. I watched all of it from the observation tier. I began to understand something I did not want to name yet. The Vorrkai are not, in any meaningful sense, tameable. I want to be clear about this, because the incident report will need to address it, and I have already had 2 queries from the station commander asking whether the new handler has self-accelerated the conditioning protocol. She has not. The conditioning protocol uses pain response and reward cycles to produce a narrow channel of acceptable behavior. What I was watching was not a narrowed channel. What I was watching was the pack making a decision. Predators decide. It is easy to forget this when you are standing behind reinforced transparent steel and watching controlled animals move through corridors on predictable schedules. But the Vorrkai are not domesticated, and they are not, in the deepest sense, controlled. They are predators who have calculated that cooperation with the station is less costly than the alternative. They make that calculation every single day. And when something changes the inputs of that calculation, when something walks into their corridor, that registers differently than anything they have seen before, they recalculate. Marin Soli was not afraid of them, not in the way every handler before her had been afraid, which is to say, not in the way that all intelligent creatures are afraid of apex predators, is to say, not in the way that registers, to an apex predator, as the correct relationship between itself and the thing in front of it. She was a 4 out of 10, she said. She had seemed to decide this was not worth acting on. The Vorrkai had spent 6 years sorting through handlers who were afraid and finding them adequate or inadequate based on whether the fear was manageable. And then one Tuesday a woman in ash-gray fatigues had walked into the corridor, and the Alpha had done its 11-second check and found something it did not have a category for. Something that was not unafraid because it was foolish or drugged, or armored or performing. Something that was simply not afraid. The way the Vorrkai themselves were not afraid, 'cause it had looked at the thing in front of it, and made a calculation, and found the calculation did not add up to fear. I think the Alpha recognized that. I think it is the only explanation for what happened on day 17. On day 17, inmate block representative Corvan Sess, a man who had been incarcerated at Harrow for 11 years, for crimes I am not permitted to discuss in this port, found a way to be in the corridor access junction at the same time as Marin's morning feeding round. I do not know how he managed this. I am still investigating. What I know is that he said something to her that I did not hear through the viewport, and she turned to look at him, and 2 of the Vorrkai juveniles were between them, before I had finished processing what I was seeing. They did not touch him. They stood between him and Marin, with their armored crests raised and their rearmost legs spread wide in the grounding stance, which is the stance that precedes a strike. Sess was against the wall within half a second. He did not move again until Marin said mildly that it was all right and turned back to the feed canisters. The juveniles looked at her for 3 seconds. Then they sat down. Sess was removed from the corridor, and I noted the incident in the log, but did not escalate it, because no one had been harmed and I was not sure how to characterize what I had seen. I was not sure the forms had a box for it. The forms definitely did not have a box for what happened on day 22. Enforcer Chief Hesov had been overseeing Harrow's security detail for 4 years. He was competent, methodical, and possessed of the conviction, common among security professionals of his particular background, that the correct response to something that did not fit the protocol was to make it fit the protocol by force if necessary. He had read my incident reports on Marin Sol's first 3 weeks with what I can only describe as increasing impatience. He had twice suggested that I was permitting an undertrained contractor to establish unsafe working practices. He had once, in my presence, described her as a liability. On day 22, he came to the observation tier to see for himself. He watched for perhaps 12 minutes. During those 12 minutes, Marin completed the morning feed, ran her hand along the Alpha's right lateral plate in a motion that had apparently become a routine between them, and crouched beside the smallest juvenile to check a joint that had been showing minor stiffness. The juvenile made a sound I had not heard the Vorrkai make before, low, sustained, somewhere in frequency between a purr and a struck cable under tension, and leaned into her hand. Hesov said, "She is not following safety protocol." "No," he said. "I am going to put an end to this." I said, "Hesov." He was already moving toward the corridor access. "Sht. I want to be precise about the timeline because the incident report required precision, and I was watching from the observation tier with a clear line of sight." Hesov entered Pen Corridor C in full articulated armor. He walked toward Marin Sol at a pace I would describe as purposeful. The Vorrkai registered his entry. The 2 nearest adults came to their feet, but did not move to intercept because he was armored and his biometric signature was in their conditioning file as a non-threat. He reached Marin. He took hold of her left arm above the elbow. He said, loudly enough that I heard it through the viewport seal, "This is over." What happened next took 4 seconds. I am not going to describe it in clinical detail because the medical report will do that, and I have no desire to add to it. What I will say is this: the Alpha did not charge. The Alpha moved, which is a different thing. The charge is the Vorrkai's threat display, the raised crest, the splayed limbs, the percussion of 800 kilograms in forward motion. What the Alpha did was not a display. It was a decision, executed. It covered 4 meters in less time than it takes to say so. The articulated armor Hesov was wearing was rated for deterrent impact up to force, Class 3. I do not know precisely what force class the Alpha's shoulder strike constitutes. I know that Hesov was against the far wall and on the floor before I reached the emergency seal control, and I know that 2 of the adults were standing over him, and neither of them was making a sound, which is more frightening. I have learned. Then when they make a sound, Marin said, "Easy, just the one word. Quiet." The same register she used when she told the smallest juvenile to let her check its joint. The Alpha turned its head toward her. She said, "I'm fine. Easy." The Alpha held her gaze for 2 seconds, then it stepped back from Hesov. The 2 adults parted. Hesov lay on the floor and did not move, but his biometrics were transmitted, and I could see on the corridor panel that he was conscious, which was more than I had expected. Marin looked at Hesov. She looked at the Alpha. She crouched down beside the Alpha and ran her hand along the crest, the same motion she had used 1,000 times in 3 weeks. And the great armored head that turned toward her, and she scratched behind the forward sensory cluster, which is a place no handler before her had touched without losing the hand. The low sound came again, that cable under tension sound. I released the breath I had been holding since Hesov walked through the door. I filed the report. I listed Hesov's injuries were significant but not permanent. I listed the precipitating action: unauthorized entry and physical contact with a contractor during active animal handling, against protocol. I listed the Vorrkai's response as within observed behavioral parameters, which is the closest I could come to the truth in language the forms would accept. The truth is this: the Vorrkai are not tamed. They will never be tamed. In 22 years, I have watched this station cycle through handlers and conditioning protocols and escalating deterrent measures, and what I have learned is that there is no cage for an apex predator that the apex predator has not, on some level, agreed to occupy. The Vorrkai are here because they have decided the arrangement suits them. And the arrangement suits them in part, I believe, because it occasionally puts something interesting in front of them, something that walks into their corridor without the smell of managed fear, and stands there while the alpha breathes and runs the calculation and comes up empty on the expected answer. Marin's soul is still in fatigues. She has not worn the gauntlets since day one. She submits accurate, terse reports, and she has asked for a revision to the nutritional spec to account juvenile's growth rate, which she calculated from scratch in 2 days and which our staff veterinarian reviewed and approved without modification. She does not appear to find any of this remarkable. Yesterday, I watched her sit on the corridor floor with her back against the wall and eat her lunch, and the full pack arranged itself around her in a loose ring, the adults at the perimeter, the juveniles closer in, and the alpha lay its great plated head in her lap, and she ate her nutrition bar and scratched behind its sensory cluster, without looking up from the report she was reading. 6 tons of apex predator, vibrating at that low cable frequency. She ate her lunch. I am a man who has spent 22 years learning to aim things before they kill someone. I know what I saw. The alpha did not decide Marin Sole was safe. The alpha decided she was one of them, and that is not a category I have a form for, and I find that I do not particularly want one. The Vorrkai are not tamed. They have simply recognized something. I think that is worse. Hesov's perspective. And I think, sitting up here on the observation tier, watching her turn a page in her report while 600 kilograms of armored predator purrs in her lap, that it is the most correct thing I have ever seen.